Alright, let's start the video with who doesn't. Any of these damn brats are two actual candidates. Both have cases to be made that they would die in Fredbear's. FNaF 2 heavily implies that Fredbear's is older than Freddy's 0, which is my name for the original Freddy's before Freddy's 2, where the missing children's incident happened. Specifically, we know Freddy's 0 is where it happens because that's where the animatronic suits that are the withered animatronics come from, and those are the suits that are noted as smelling, presumably, of rotten kids, which is a running detail throughout the series, which helps us know which suits are the ones the kids were killed and stuffed into. This already implies the MCI could be after Fredbear's, or at least in the years after, and in both the novels and Fazbear Fights, the MCI happens around 1985, which would be strongly after 1983, which is the latest we know Fredbear's existed, presumably when it's closed. We never see or are given any proof it lasted any longer. And we blatantly know the MCI is after Charlie's death, not just because we see her giving gifts and life to the kids, but because Henry blatantly says, "a wound first inflicted on me," referring to William's murder sprees. So if it's a wound first inflicted on him, that would place Charlie's death before the MCI. The only potential counterpoint is something that, as I've talked about in prior videos, I think is a bit misused, which is Susie's line, "I was the first. I have seen everything." I think it actually might be more likely that she's saying, "I was the first to come to life." Because if you think about it, unless William is the one stuffing kids, which is pretty much a novel exclusive concept because we see Charlie do it with the kids, they give them life, which probably would be stuffing them, or she does some other extra step, which gets back to this point I'm about to make, which is dead kids can't see things before they possess animatronics. They would have to possess their characters to be able to see things, and presumably, William isn't just killing kids and then stuffing them right away. And even more presumably, they aren't coming to life until Charlie does something to them, whether it be stuffing them or just granting them life that allows them to be alive at all. So if Susie actually died first, she wouldn't be able to see anything. This is why that second line is in there. "I have seen everything." Because what it's trying to say is she saw the others come to life. And you little jester-possessing bitch. I don't know how or why people are so insistent on making Elizabeth the first victim, but this has become a pet peeve that's really starting to rub me raw. First, the actual in-game implications of Baby's Pizza World can be interpreted a few ways. As I point out in my Safe Room video, which is part of the reason I made that video, there might be an argument to be made that Baby's Pizza World was the place mentioned in the FNaF 3 phone tapes where a spring lock failure happened, causing the spring lock suits to be decommissioned. That would place Baby's Pizza World as coexisting with Freddy's 0. Or the other kind of clue about when Pizza World exists is that it's some proximity to the rental service. In the teaser, closed due to leaks, it stated that you should look out for Circus Baby in your local party, which seems to be a reference to how the rental service would send out their animatronics to local birthday parties. And this is, by the way, in response to the closing of Baby's Pizza World. And unlike the 83 versus 87 debate that was caused by the FNaF 4 source code, there's nothing contradicting it in sister location that would make us think otherwise. So it is reasonable to say that this is a canon concept that Baby's Pizza World directly goes into the rental service once it's closed, and remember it's only open for a day, a sort of test day on which Elizabeth dies. Which would mean the rental service opens some reasonable time after Pizza World closes. And that's important because Hand Unit states at the start of Sister Location that the rental service was made to cash in on the success of Freddy's after it's closed. So Baby's Pizza World has to exist with some level of reasonable proximity to the rental service, which is after Freddy's, which means a minimum of 1985, or a maximum of about 1993, or even later if you think FNaF 1 is later. Pretty much all of which obviously places it after 1983 with the bite victim and or Charlie. Let's talk about the one thing that everyone is using so hard to try and claim that Elizabeth is the first victim, or at least that she's before the bite victim, that she's not in FNaF 4. And the nightmares have stomachs mouth, and the bite victim is scared of animatronics, therefore, or he must have seen Baby kill Elizabeth with their stomach hatch thing. The issue being that Fredbear is the only one of the batch to have the stomach mouth, along with Nightmare, who's just kind of a recolored, tweaked. There's some changes, but he's primarily just a recolored Fredbear. But there's a twofold problem with this connection. Beyond just the fact that Fredbear is the only one, it's almost like he's a Nightmare version of a springlock suit that people climb into. Which, to a kid who misunderstands something, a clue Scott specifically gave us regarding this situation, would look like an animatronic is eating them, especially if you're climbing into the torso that you've opened up, which I don't think it's ever specifically stated that's how you do it, but that seems to be some extent how you do it. But more importantly, A misunderstanding implies there is something not devious about what the bite victim sees. Seeing his sister be grabbed by a giant metal claw out of a murder clown is not a misunderstanding. That's just what happened. Is it weird that she's one of the only two Aftons we don't see in FNaF 4? Yes. But also, Elizabeth wasn't introduced in the series at all at this point. So there's kind of this level of gray room where you could say, oh, maybe Scott had earlier plans for her that changed, and or she wasn't fully planned or really thought through yet, and or he wanted to imply there's a sister but didn't want to develop her story all the way because this was meant to be the ending. So we weren't meant to think about it too much. And then you have Ultimate Dream Theory, where I talk about how that might be a retcon, and etc. You get the point. I'm just trying to get through the whole Elizabeth rant as soon as possible. To get to the real meat and potatoes of this discussion, the two characters who have an actual chance of being the first victims. Charlie and the bite victim. Now, before I get into the evidence, it's important to recognize why this matters. Why do we care who the first victim is other than just having an objective timeline? It's because this completely changes the context of Charlie's death. The bite victim can kind of die at any point, and his story won't change too much. But William is the one who changes. If William kills Charlie first, he's a pure-blooded psychopath from the start. He's either killing Charlie just because he had a good chance, and or he's just jealous of Henry, or he just wanted to kill her. This William is on a fundamental level evil from the start, and just kind of gets generally worse or more extreme in his habits. There really isn't a change in this William's arc, he just kind of becomes more. Let's call this William Dave Miller due to the similarities to Silver Eyes William. In contrast, there's the William who lost his son to an animatronic made by Henry and wanted to make him suffer as a consequence. He's still a psychopath kind of from the start, but this could be more like a drunk, opportunistic William. One who sees a chance to make Henry suffer in response to something that Henry indirectly did by creating Fredbear. Now there's a lot of overlap here. It doesn't change William's character completely. I think this William's still a fucking lunatic right from the get-go. It creates this catalyst moment where the bite victim dying is basically a canon event, for lack of a better term, that leads to both William becoming a killer and Mike becoming redeemed. Let's call him Steve Raglan, just in the case this ends up being this kind of interpretation of William in the movie. Also, I just want a different term for William, since saying this is the true William or the other is the true William would set a lot of people off. Now, if I'm being completely honest, a lot of the evidence moving forward is pretty circular and kind of leads to a lot of dead ends I don't see people talking about. It's very easy to take a lot of these points and ignore other counterpoints to create a feedback loop where you tell your own version of the story. If you start with the assumption that William is a psychopath, you can explain a lot of his actions when Charlie dies first under this logic. If you start with William being a grieving father who takes a chance to make his business partner suffer, you can explain a lot of his actions through that. I think the sort of nail in the coffin that should decide things is Midnight Motorist, whether you think it's Michael running away or the bite victim or a missing kid. Now it's time for everyone's favorite segment. Sasquatch talks about the couch potato for way too long! Firstly, let's talk about what this damn sprite is named, because I was misinformed in my Michael video that this sprite was called Man Sitting. It's called Backdrop 26. Man Sitting is a literal fan name people have been using as proof all this time. Now, let's focus on the evidence of why people were claiming Couch Potato is Michael. The gray shirt. This has so many problems in particular, namely Michael not only is not always associated with the gray shirt, he has a purple shirt in Sister Location, which was the direct prior appearance to this one, but so many characters are associated with gray that this is kind of a moot point. The text color has the same issue. Not only is the bite victim's text color close, but there's a lot of characters who just have this kind of coloration. Most confusingly would be Desk Person. Is Desk Person the Couch Person just because their colors are similar? I don't think so, and I think that's part of the problem with this. Not to mention, there are a lot of characters we just don't have consistent coloration for to compare to. For example, if this was Miss Afton, this would be her only appearance in the main original series by Scott, which means we have no reference point to say she is or isn't this character. Michael does have a prior appearance, but we never seem to talk in Sister Location to know if there's a difference there. For example, a problem where we don't have a lot of reference points to compare font color changing is Psychic Friend Fredbear and William. If these are both William, there's a kind of change, but it's not an extreme change. I mean, we just don't have many examples of this hypothetical where Scott is trying to keep the colors loosely the same between continuity points. Orange Guy could be the example or the outlier. We don't know. Almost every character, with a very few exceptions in FNaF 4, the only other example of characters correlating to font colors, match their colors with a prominent color in their design. And Pigtail Girl, who is genuinely just an outlier completely separate from everyone else. And given that Scott matches text color to core colors, and we have a lot of examples of this, if Scott did arbitrarily decide this character would have a gray shirt, they would have gray text automatically. So I think both their text color and main color palette are a non-factor in this argument. And not to mention, their entire character from what we have relative to Mike is pretty different. Couch Potato is almost lifeless and blunt with their one sentence. Compare "leave him alone tonight, he had a rough day" to "you heard the little man, he wants to get even closer. Hey guys, I think the little man says he wants to give Fredbear a big kiss." I think the only time in the series where it gets even remotely close to this is a few lines in the survival logbook, but even then they're kind of snarky jokes. And the one moment where he's being kind of serious with the bite victim in the hospital, which is still not quite the same as this lifeless dialogue that the Couch Potato has. And as I've stated a few times before, the bite victim running away really doesn't make much sense in character for him. Now, you could argue he's traumatized by what he'll see this night or in the future, and that's what makes him a crybaby in the main game. However, I'm just skeptical of that in general. It just feels really out of character for him to break a window to run off to Fredbear's, and then just completely 180 in personality to being a crying little brat. But Michael, from the start, is a troublemaker. He locks his brother in the back room, I think? Is that what's happening here? He stands up to animatronics as he grows up. He only goes on to do bigger and bigger things. And furthermore, there's an argument to be made that this is after Fredbear's closes, because Juniors, if you lay out the map, is where Fredbear's would be in the FNaF 4 location relative to its house. Granted, on a stormy, rainy night, in contrast. So it feels like there's an argument to be made that Fredbear's has been closed and moved on from. Not to mention, there's more arguments to be made about how this story arc sets up Mike's rooms and the difference between the nightmare rooms, and I really just need to make a new video remastering my whole argument someday. But that's kind of the gist for this video. And Midnight Motorist is so important because depending on which interpretation you follow, you have a concrete rule for which character dies first. If the bite victim dies first, then this is Mike running off in grief after what he did. Or at least he's been running away because of that. And that William is set into a drunker stupor from Juniors and kills Charlie opportunistically that night. But if Charlie dies first, this could be the night that the bite victim runs off and maybe learns that a kid died there at Freddy's that day. I don't know why they're open that late, because it's specifically labeled at night, but... And yes, it is later that night, the internal name of the lore part of Midnight Motorist. So Midnight Motorist has to be later that night in general, and as I've said, it's later that night after Charlie dies, and the bite victim's alive, obviously he's not dead. And if Mike's the one to run away, then it seems like the bite victim's already been dead. And then there's kind of an option 3.5, where this is the night that William killed the MCI kids and is luring one extra kid, or potentially luring a kid that will be in the MCI. Now this creates some weird timeline shenanigans, because this would mean Charlie either dies literally like hours before the MCI, and the other variant of this theory, which is he's already killed the MCI, and this is later that night where he lures Andrew from the books to kill him, which I find this theory flawed for several reasons, and I kind of just dismiss it for the sake of this video because I feel like the evidence isn't very convincing. Two biggest things beyond Midnight Motorist are pretty contradictory with each other. It creates a real chicken and the egg situation. Security Puppet's name implies to some extent that it was made to protect after something happened, but what we're specifically seeing it do is trying to prevent Charlie from reaching the exit. So maybe there's an argument to be made that something happened in the company's history that Henry is trying to prevent from happening again, and maybe you could argue that specific thing is the bite victim dying, but that's really odd because the bite victim's death has nothing to do with going to the exit or leaving the building. The other weird argument that you could argue is that the puppet isn't in FNaF 4, which could argue it hasn't been created yet, which I'd argue is a lot more interesting than Elizabeth not being there, because Elizabeth wasn't really properly introduced until Sister Location, which didn't come out for 1.5 years after FNaF 4. Whereas the puppet had been in every game other than FNaF 4 and FNaF 1 up to this game. So their absence in FNaF 4 is a bit more interesting because they were pre-established. But then you could argue what the bite victim saw. Did he not see anything? How could he be afraid of the animatronics if he didn't see anything? But the issue goes back there. Just like how the security puppet protects from something that isn't how the bite happens, which is going through the exit, the bite victim isn't scared of leaving Fredbear's, which is what he should be afraid of if he saw Charlie die. Also, all of his fears seem to tie to the animatronics and the people in the animatronic suits. We aren't really shown any scenes of him being scared of the employees, which I feel like if the point is that he's scared of the employees, Scott would have shown. These two incidents aren't really connected. Other than maybe the puppet not being a FNaF 4, which you could just argue that he was taken down because Charlie's already died, so maybe you could argue it that way. There's not really a point I can get at with Security Puppet or what the bite victim saw, because they're just not related to each other. In fact, this was my one problem with Ultimate Dream Theory, is that bite victim's fears don't really have anything to do with potentially someone else dying. Especially with the whole, what's seen in shadows is misunderstood by a child. In my honest opinion, the most objective takeaway may just be that these just are separate incidents. The Security Puppet was made just because Henry wants to keep his daughter safe and in the building. The bite victim's fear, at least in the modern lore, is just tied to the springlock suits. Not even him seeing as failure or anything. I think he just is scared of the concept of someone climbing into a suit thinking it's eating someone, which is why Nightmare Fredbear would be the only character with the stomach mouths and not any other one. He's one of the only suits you could climb into, which maybe to a child would look like an animatronic eating someone from their stomach out. Though that gets into some really weird nebulous territory with the nightmares in general, especially with Mike seeing Fredbear, which raises so many questions about did William design the animatronics based on Mike and or the bite victim's fears, or I don't even fucking know. That's another topic for another day. For the sake of this video, let's just say that entire argument's a dead end. The next on the chopping block is this line that I feel like so many people use so out of context and so matter-of-factly as if it's a confirmed canon statement that is supposed to be interpreted this very specific way, which is Henry's line, "A wound first inflicted on me." I am 70% sure this line is just saying, Charlie is William's first kill, and that's all we're supposed to get out of that. Because the entire monologue is talking about William's action, and how this incident, he did this, he did that. So in the context, it would be like, you know in articles they use the parenthetical he, where the full line would be a wound he first inflicted on me. Unless Henry was talking in a cosmic sense, where the universe or God first inflicted this wound on him from Freddy's. But that's not the context we're using here. This isn't what Henry's talking about at all. He's not talking in a cosmic sense. He's talking about William's actions. And the bite victim wasn't killed by William. So if it's wounds inflicted by William, Charlie would be the first relative, even if she was the first victim overall or the first victim after the bite victim died. It doesn't change anything either way. Obviously, the issue still persists. Which of these two brats are the first? And we're at a bit of a logistical standstill. The only details that really could imply this one way or the other would be if Michael or the bite victim were confirmed to be the runaway. And yes, there is the Charlie plush theory, but I feel that even if that was the original intent, it's been completely overridden with William being the plush as seen in Sis location. I know there's the whole argument of, oh, Charlie's the one in the last segment, but frankly, if I'm being brutally honest, I feel like this is a bit of an argument to try and justify dialogue being a different color. It might have had more ground if "I will put you back together" was some exclusive line to the ghostly set of eyes in FNaF world and this plush, but it's not. Mike says he was told by William in some capacity to go put Elizabeth back together, specifically using that phrase, a specific clue I feel like Scott was trying to see out to us, especially after giving us the whole secret room. I feel like this game is screaming and trying to clarify that William is the one who had the plush. Now, you might be able to argue the puppet also says these things in FNaF World, but I feel like it's really weird if out of nowhere the puppet swoops in to have this one-line dialogue that William also just goes on to happen to say. However, if William's the one saying this, and the puppet learns about the bite victim's memories through the events of FNaF World or before the events of FNaF World or etc., and copies them in a new light saying like, no, I'll put you back together, that kind of adds up and makes some level of sense to me. Whereas her saying it first is just really weird, because that would mean this plush just starts talking in this nebulous void and William just happens to say the same thing. As for what I think, I just stand by the bite victim probably the first. This is mainly because I support Mike being the runaway, and that seals that argument pretty much completely. I feel like it would just make more sense for the bite victim to go first, because his story is really weird otherwise. Yeah, he still serves as the setup for Mike's character arc, so he's not pointless in the story. But even under Free Victim and other theories, there's not really a lot for him to do after he dies. Whereas if he sets up the main killer and the main protagonist, that's a pretty damn important role that makes him still relevant, and maybe he does more beyond that. I'm not opposed to a lot of those theories, except for Mike Hell, but I feel like if this is a story where the dumb little crybaby could play a part, this would be the place he would be. it also lines up just with the year 1983 we're given, which feels like a big thing of like, hey, this is the earliest year we're ever given, really, for the main series. And also, it's one of the only accidents that happens ever. Almost every other murder from here on out is some level of intent or malice to it. Whereas the bite victim, yeah, Mike fucked around and found out, but, like, he wasn't trying to kill the bite victim. Fredbear wasn't designed to kill kids by crushing their head. It just happened. That said, this is very much one of those, what character are you into in this kind of point? Because if you got into the series and you got into Purple Guy as a character because you wanted him to be this soulless, psychopathic killer from the start, then the version of William, Dave Miller as I call him, is still really appealing. So I totally get why people really like that character. I do like some of the aspects of William being a psychopath. I think this doting father who really does want to help and just is kind of misunderstood and just becomes corrupted by his goals is kind of too far. I think I would personally write William as a bit of a psychopath from the start, but he can kind of justify and expand on and give direction to his actions because his child dies and he wants to do more with that. He wants to see, after he kills his business partner's daughter and she comes back, if he can get that to happen with his son, and see where he can go further with that.